The book of Romans is pretty typical of one of Paul's letters. You've got several chapters of a deep explanation of the gospel, followed by several chapters of some really intense, relevant application, joined in the middle by a single word, therefore. If you see there in Romans 12:1, it says, therefore, I urge you, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your body a living sacrifice. Therefore is the word that connects the two sections. In other words, Paul expects that the radical changes he's about to describe in the last 5 chapters are going to flow out of the gospel that he has delved into in the first 11 chapters. Did you see it? Therefore, I appeal to you, brothers, by the mercies of God. The mercies of God, the gospel, are the basis of the changes he's describing are going to happen in your life. Verse 2, it says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Be transformed how? Transformed by the renewing of your minds. When I first heard that phrase, renewing your mind, I thought it meant like singing Christian music in your head all the time, waking up at 4 a.m., strumming, tunes on your harp, and that's what a renewed mind was like. That may be part of a renewed mind, but a renewed mind that Paul's talking about is a renewed mind in what? A renewed mind in the gospel he's just explained to you. You see, I've heard that there are 2 primary kinds of religious change. The first is mechanical change. That's change from the outside. That is how you change things that aren't alive. I came out one day when my oldest daughter was 4 years old, and she was standing in our backyard, and she had a watering can, and she was in her sandbox, and she was pouring water on the sand. And I said, sweetheart, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm trying to make the sand grow. She said, we're almost out of sand, and I want more of it. And I was like, well, you can't water sand and make it grow. She says, but mommy waters things with this, and they grow. Now, I'm trying to explain to her that that's not how you make sand grow, because sand's not alive. The only way for there to be more sand in that sandbox is for daddy to go buy more sand and add to it. That is mechanical change. That's how religion changes you. Religion changes you externally by adding things to your life. Religion makes you really busy, doesn't it? Gives you lots of things to do, lots of places to be, lots of things to pay attention to, lots of rules to obey. And you end up feeling like you being religious is just adding a bunch of stuff to your schedule and new ways to behave. When the church that I grew up in had these little blue envelopes in the pew rack in front of you. Anybody remember those? And on there was a little record that you were supposed to indicate of what you'd done for God that week. So it was a little line like, did you read your Bible this week? And you're supposed to put a check box. Did you pray this week? Check. Did you share Christ with somebody? Check. Did you give in the offering? Check. It used to be a game to me when I was growing up, how many of those things that I could start and do by the time the offering began to when it got back to me. So I'd be like, read the Bible, check, pray, check, share Christ. My sister heard the gospel from me every Sunday for years, so I could check off that little box. And I'd give in the offering, and it was just things that I was doing. Now, you may not be a part of a church. We may not have blue envelopes in our church, but a lot of times that's how people think about walking with God. It's things that you do. It's rules that you obey, or these external changes. Well, the problem, of course, is that if you don't really want to do those things, then they become wearisome to you. You feel like God's constantly holding up in front of you a list of things that you should be doing or things that you should be doing better, and if not, he's going to punish you. And you grow weary because you're always thinking, have I done enough now to earn God's approval? God, when is enough enough? And what happens is, if anything, you start to resent God because he is holding you captive to do stuff that you don't really want to be doing, and then threatening damnation if you don't do them right. That's mechanical change. That's fundamentally different, you see, than how a tree grows. A tree grows organically. It grows from within. In organic change, your behavior changes because you change. Things that are alive bear fruit naturally because that's just what is inside of them. When the gospel changes you, when you change organically, you start to desire God and you start to desire righteousness. That's the kind of change the gospel brings into you, and that's what Romans 12 is talking about. Therefore, in light of the mercies of God, this is how your life is going to look. You're going to be transformed by renewing your mind in the mercies of God. Let me explain to you why religious change doesn't work. In order to do that, let me first delve into the nature of what's wrong with us. Romans says that our original sin was what? You know it? Our original sin was idolatry. Paul, Romans 1:23 says that our first sin was that we worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve's first sin was they worshiped and served the tree of knowledge of good and evil and desired that more than they desired God. Now, you might have a problem seeing that because you're like, well, I don't see them like in the Garden of Eden bowing down to the tree, oh tree, we worship you. But that's because a lot of times we don't understand what worship actually is. You worship whatever you deem to be essential for life and happiness. You worship whatever it is that you feel like you could not live without. For Adam and Eve, it was a certain kind of tree. They thought we need the tree of knowledge of good and evil for happiness. For you and me, it might be any number of things. It could be money. It could be marriage. It could be having children. It could be the praise of others. It could be achieving a certain status at work. It could be a certain accomplishment that you make. It could be some sensual or sexual pleasure. And that thing becomes so important to you that you feel like you couldn't live life without it, and it begins to drive your behavior. It begins to control your emotions. You have to have it. And you begin to desire that thing more than you desire God. You see, ultimately, that's what's behind all of our sin. There's something you place a greater weight on than you do upon God. And see, if you try to correct the behavior without first correcting the heart, then you'll just end up using God at best. You'll serve God because you want to get something from Him, not because you love Him. You'll serve Him because you want to keep Him off your back, you want to avoid punishment, you want Him to bless parts of your life, and that becomes very wearisome to you, and it's also not pleasing to God. When I was in high school, I started to date a girl that I just really wasn't, that into. We didn't really seem to have chemistry. We never had what we call back then the DTR, the determine the relationship talk, and so I wasn't really sure of our status, and the crisis came when we were still kind of dating around Christmas time. Now, every guy knows that if you're dating a girl at Christmas time, you are obligated to get her a gift, right? But I wasn't really sure if we were officially dating or not. So I was supposed to see her 2 days before Christmas, and so I had this terrible thought. I'm like, am I supposed to get this girl a Christmas present? Because, if she gets me a Christmas present and I don't get her one, then I look like a dirtbag. But I don't want to drop $70 on some girl I've got no future with. So I'm driving out to see her. She lived 45 minutes away from me, and I swung into the mall. And I ran in and I went into a sporting goods shop, and there I saw it. It was perfect. It was an Adidas neck warmer. You wore it when you went skiing. It said Adidas in great big letters right here. It was $7. $7. I thought that's perfect because that looks like it's a lot more expensive, and I'm gonna buy that. And if she gives me a Christmas present, I'm gonna give that to her. And if she doesn't give me anything, that puppy's mine. So I got it. I wrapped it up, boxed it up, put it in my back seat under, when nobody could see it. I drove the other, 40 minutes out to see her. I go up, I knock on her door. She opens the door. First thing out of her mouth, I got you a Christmas present. I was like, I got you a Christmas present too. And she ran and went underneath her Christmas tree, and she pulls out this beautifully wrapped box. And I'm opening it up, and when I open it up, I hold up, to my horror, I could tell, I'm not a clothing connoisseur, but I could tell that was an expensive sweater. It was a top-of-the-line piece of clothing. And she's like, do you like it? I said, I love it. And she said, well, where's my gift? And I said, I left your gift at home. Of course, it's in the backseat of my car, but I'm thinking, then I get to go home, and then I get to go out and buy a new gift and mail it to her. She said, she says, we really don't have any plans tonight. My parents aren't here, so we can't stay here. So maybe I haven't seen your parents in a long time. Maybe we should drive back to your house and you could just give me the gift there. I said, that sounds like a great idea. And so we get in the car, drive 45 minutes home. I walk into my house. I told her, would you wait here for a minute? I go in to see my mother, and I'm like, Mom, do we have anything that we were going to give to, I have a younger sister who's 3 years younger than me. So do we have anything we were going to give to her that she didn't know about yet? And my mom said, she said, what? I said, I don't care, just something that costs like $50 or something. So my mom goes digging through the closet, comes up with something, puts it in a box, put this girl's name on it, takes my sister's name off, puts this girl's on. I go walking out in the thing, I'm like, here's your gift. And she opens it up, and sure enough, it's a nearly identical in level, piece of clothing. Now, let me ask, especially you girls, let me ask you a question. This is a very upstanding girl. She's very respectable. Do you think, had she known the circumstances of that gift, do you think she would have been honored and flattered to receive it? Do you think it would have brought joy to her? No. No, I mean, she would have been insulted by that. She had no idea, at least until this Bible study series has come out, and she's sitting in some living room somewhere listening to this or something, but she would not have received that, because no girl wants to receive something that is given to her out of obligation. Somehow we think God is different, that God is pleased and he's glorified when we do a bunch of stuff for him that we don't really want to be doing. That is wearisome to us. It's also not pleasing at all to God. What God desires is a heart that desires him. All right, so our original sin was idolatry. Well, what was the first effect of our sin? The first effect of our sin, if you remember back from the Garden of Eden, was a sense of nakedness. Now question, were they naked before they sinned? Yes, but they weren't really bothered by their nakedness. Why not? The early church theologians had a great answer for this. They said that their nakedness didn't bother them because they were clothed in the love and the acceptance of God. Now, having been stripped of that love and acceptance, now they felt ashamed. Now they felt like something was missing, something was wrong. God's approval was no longer on them, and so they felt naked and ashamed. And so what did they do? Well, they did what you do when you feel naked. If you're normal. What do you do? What do you do if you feel naked? If you have a problem sleepwalking and you wake up at Super Walmart at 3 a.m. and you're buck naked, what do? You're like, oh, well, I'm here. I might as well pick up some stuff for the house. No, you cover yourself. Adam and Eve immediately looked for a covering to take away their shame. That's actually a pretty good picture of the human soul. The human soul has a sense of nakedness, a sense of shame. We know that we're missing something. It's like we're not good enough. So what we do is we try to find a way to cover ourselves. We try to find a way to prove that we are worthy to be loved. So we're always trying to establish our worthiness, to lift ourselves above other people. We find some reason why we're better, we're smarter, something we latch onto that makes us feel worthy. You don't have to be religious to do this. Everybody does it. You always find something that sets yourself apart that gives you a sense of worthiness. Maybe you got into a certain kind of school. Maybe you have a certain job and make a certain amount of money. Maybe you're really religious and you feel like you're so religious that just makes you better than other people. Maybe it's that, well, you're like, I'm a really good mother, and that's kind of where I find my sense of worth is, I may not be good at all these things, but I'm a great mother. Even the mafia has their own standard. Tony Soprano kills hundreds of people, but he's a good son. And that makes him, in his eyes, good. It's a way of covering nakedness. I've heard it said that it's like life for us is one big Survivor episode, and we're trying to convince everybody else that we're not the one that ought to be thrown off the island. Right? So again, what happens here is people get religious not because they love God, but because they're trying to establish their worthiness in his eyes. They're doing things for God because they want something from him. And see, that means their service to God is not born from love of God. It's actually done in a way to benefit themselves. Let me tell you a story that maybe will help you get your mind around that. Charles Spurgeon, a famous British pastor of the 19th century, told a story about a farmer who just was very, very poor. He grew onions and potatoes and carrots on his farm. Well, one day he walked out into his garden and he saw the largest carrot he had ever seen. I don't even know how big that would be, but maybe like a carrot like 3 feet long or something. So he takes this carrot and he makes a trip to the palace where the king lives. And he gets an audience with the king and he says, King, you've always been my favorite king. You've been so good to us. You're such a kind and generous and wonderful king. And as an act of my appreciation and love for you, I wanted to give you this carrot just as a token of my loyalty. Well, the king was genuinely touched by this man's offering. And he looked at the man and he said, son, I happen to own all of the property near where your farm is. And I'd actually like to give you a large portion of that property just as a gift and just because I care about you as my subject. Well, there was one of the king's noblemen was standing in the king's court there and watching all this go down. And that nobleman thought, wow, I mean, if that's what the king would give in response to a carrot, imagine what he would give for a real gift, like a horse. So that night, the nobleman went out and found the most beautiful horse he'd ever seen, a big, majestic horse. And the next day, he marches that thing into the king's presence, and he says, "King, oh king, I love you so much, and it's been such a joy and a privilege to serve you all these years. And as a token of my appreciation, I wanted to give you this large horse to show you how much I cared about you and how loyal I am to you." Well, the king, who was also pretty wise, saw through this ruse, and he said to the nobleman, he said, yesterday that farmer was giving the carrot to me. Today, you were giving this horse to yourself. You see, when you and I are doing things for God because it is a way of elevating our worthiness before God, or it's a way that we avoid punishment or get blessing, we're not doing them because we love God. We're doing them really because we love ourselves. It's not really an act of service to God. It's an act of self-protection. And see, that is wearisome both to you and to God. And what happens is this constant state of trying to cover your nakedness and prove your worthiness leads you through cycles of pride and despair. You're proud when you feel like you're doing better than everybody else. Well, pride just leads to more sin. We know that. And then when you're not doing very well, you plunge into despair. And despair leads you to a whole nother set of sins. And so this whole approach of nakedness, where we're trying to do enough to be accepted by God, doesn't lead us to righteousness. It leads us to more sin. And it makes us weary, and it makes us resent the God who seems to be saying, not enough. The gospel is something entirely different. The gospel tells you not to change in order to earn the approval of God. The gospel tells you to change because you have the approval of God. Therefore, in light of the mercies of God, this is how you'll be transformed. You see, the gospel is that Christ lived the life that you and I were supposed to live, and then died to death that you and I were condemned to die in our place. It's what theologians call the great exchange. Christ lived the life I should have lived, but then he exchanged the death that I should have died and made that his, so that in him, his righteousness could become mine. That's what theologians call gift righteousness. God's righteousness and acceptance given to us not as something that we earn, but something God gives us freely as a gift that he earned, that he paid for and offered to us freely. And it is in light of the greatness of that gift. It is in response to the beauty of the God that we see in the story of the gospel that we change. You see, write this down. Number one, what the gospel does is it reveals God's beauty in a way that we begin to desire him. It reveals God's beauty to us in a way that we begin to desire him. You see, love is always a response. Love can't be commanded. That's the dilemma with the great commandment. You know, the great commandment, Matthew 22:37, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. The dilemma is, how can you be commanded to love somebody? I mean, think back to, if you're married, to the time that you saw that special person, you can't be commanded to love them. Love is a response. The first time that I saw my wife, I felt like I fell in love with her. I saw her beauty. I saw things about her character. The more that I've gotten to know her over the years, the more in love I've fallen with her, because love is a response to beauty. The story of the gospel shows you God's beauty so that you begin to desire him. It awakens in you the understanding of the beauty of God, and that calls forth these affections for him. Number two, the gospel reveals God's mercy so that we begin to love him. The gospel reveals God's mercy so that we begin to love him. D. Martin Lloyd-Jones, another British pastor of the 20th century, explained it this way. He said, if you were out of your home and there was a friend at your house, and when you got home, the friend said, somebody came to the door and you owed them some money and I paid that for you. What's your response to that friend? Well, it depends on how much they paid for you, right? If they're like, hey, you had some undue postage, I paid 37 cents for you, then you slap them on the back, you say, I appreciate it, right? If they say, actually it was the IRS, you owed 10 years of back taxes and they were going to take you to jail, but I paid off your debt entirely, so you're actually free of your debt and you're not going to jail. Then you don't just slap them on the back and say, thank you. You fall at their feet and say, command me, right? The gospel reveals the mercy of God in a way that it moves us. We begin to love him. So you see, there's your therefore. Therefore, in light of the mercies of God, if your eyes are open to the beauty of God and the mercy of God revealed in the gospel, that you begin to love him. Our love for God is a response to his great love for us. That's what the Apostle John said in 1 John 4:19. We love him because he first loved us. Love toward God grows out of an experience of the love of God. Jesus would say it this way in John 15. He said, if you abide in my love, then you'll bear much fruit. The word abide is the Greek word meno, which literally means to make your home in. If you'll make your home in my love, if you'll rest in my love, then spiritual fruit will come from you as naturally as roses do on a rose bush. The way that you produce spiritual fruit is not by focusing on and buckling down and thinking about making spiritual fruit. There's actually an analogy here with physical fruit. I mean, think about it. When a man and woman conceive physical fruit, a child, when they conceive that child, they're not thinking about the mechanics of making that child. They're caught up in a moment of loving intimacy with one another, and the fruit of that, the offspring of that, is a child. Well, in the same way, we don't generate spiritual fruit by thinking about producing the spiritual fruits. You know, a lot of people walk around, they're like, oh, I gotta have more love for God, I gotta have more love for others, I gotta be more patient. So all day long, patient, patient, patient. I gotta be patient here, I gotta be patient there. You don't produce spiritual fruit by focusing on spiritual fruit. Just like with physical fruit, you get caught up in a moment of loving intimacy with Jesus Christ. And the fruit of that is love, joy, peace, gentleness, kindness, long-suffering, those things. You see, we focus on the fruit, and what the gospel tells us is to focus on the love of Jesus. Because when you make your home in that love, when you make your home in God's acceptance given to you as a gift, that's what produces spiritual fruit in you. You begin to love him in light of the love that he's given to you. That's what gospel-centered change is all about. Gospel-centered change is not about giving you a list of things that you need to go and do for God. Gospel-centered change is about you standing in awe of what God has done for you. You see, listen, God is not just after obedience. He's after a whole new kind of obedience, an obedience that is born from desire.